Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to this Global Protection Cluster Forum webinar. The focus for this webinar is on preparedness for protection in the context of disasters and climate change. And this event has been organized by UNHCR with the the Gender-Based Violence Area of Responsibility, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and IOM. And my name is Michelle Yonetani, working with UNHCR's Office of the Special Advisor on Climate Action, and I'm your moderator for the event today. You're all very, very welcome. Before we get going, just a couple of housekeeping rules. So to remind everyone, this is actually a recorded event. So if anyone is not comfortable with that, please be aware. Also, I think you all probably are quite expert on these webinars by now, but please do keep your microphone on mute and your video off for the throughout the event. Only the speakers and myself will be showing video. Also, you will see later on that that there is a chat box, which is being also facilitated by one of our colleagues, and you'll be getting some messages in there. And if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat box to others, please feel free to do so. During some of the plenary discussions later on, we're going to be using the Q&A box, question and answer box, a link for which you'll also find on the bottom of your screen. So could we move on to the next slide, please? Great, so just to take us all through the agenda quickly. So in a moment, I'm going to be handing over to William Chemali, the Global Protection Cluster Coordinator, for his opening remarks. Then we're going to be hearing from Paul White, who's a Senior Protection Advisor for ProCap, working for UNHCR in Afghanistan right now, though he's actually calling us today from his home in Australia. Followed by that, we're going to be having listening to experiences from 3 different countries, from Burundi, Mozambique, and also from the region of the Pacific. From Burundi, we're going to be hearing from Eliza Gallos, who's a program manager with the Migrant Protection and Assistance Program in IOM Burundi, and also from her colleague Emmanuel Noel, who is a program manager on disaster risk reduction in Burundi. There will, of course, be then some time for you all to ask questions, for us to have a little session and discussion. A 5-minute break for everyone to stretch their legs, because this is a 2-hour seminar going on through till 1 o'clock Central European Standard Time. And after the break, we'll be hearing from Nelson Tivan, who's working for the Norwegian Refugee Council, and is the project lead on what's called the Words into Action on Disaster Displacement in Mozambique, followed by our colleague in the Pacific, Andrew McElroy, who's the head of office for the UN Office on Disaster Risk Reduction's sub-regional office in the Pacific. Another Q&A session. Then Nancy Politan-Tulieres, the Senior Protection Officer for the GPC Ops Cell, will be leading us through, talking to us about the next steps following this event. And then we'll finally hear some closing remarks from Cecilia Roselli, the Director for NRC Geneva and the Head of Humanitarian Policy. Great. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome William for some opening remarks. Thank you, William.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Can you confirm that you can hear me well?
Loud and clear.
Welcome, everyone, to the last sprint of the Global Protection Cluster Annual Forum 2020. This year's forum has been rich, with over 25 sessions and several thousand participants. We have had 3 types of sessions. One dedicated for the group of coordinators, where we have consistently managed to bring together staff dedicated to the national, subnational clusters and the specialized areas of responsibility. A second type was thematic in nature and was open to the wider group of protection actors, including, of course, many national and local actors, as well as consistent participation of member states. The third type of sessions was designed to be operational in nature. This has resulted in concrete decisions to ensure the operational footprint of the protection cluster is being implemented and taken forward, and that our commitment to make sure that the basics are in place in all our operations is now measurable, transparent, and public. We will close the forum with the launch of the 2021 GHO this year in November. So the last final session of the forum will be annexed to the launch of the GHO. And learning from all the sessions throughout this forum, we will define benchmarks, very concrete benchmarks, where we will challenge ourselves, protection actors, and member states to ensure that protection plans and responses next year are commensurate to the challenges on the front lines. These benchmarks will be again public, will be very transparent in taking them forward, and that hopefully will show progress in terms of having all the basics in place in all our operations. Now, today's roundtable is on the preparedness for protection in the context of disasters and climate change. I would like to take a moment and highlight 4 key reasons why we're having this discussion. First, because we have to. It is the reality of where we operate. It is simply our job. In over 70% of the operations where the cluster is active, climate change and climate shocks are a major driver in increasing protection risks and changing their nature. I repeat, in 70% of the operations where we're active. That's not accidental, that's the norm, that's where we operate. According to the ICRC, 12 of the 20 countries that are ranked the most vulnerable and the least ready to adapt to climate change, 12 of them are in conflict. And in these 12, we are present and coordinating. So the topic stands on its own. It's our job to deliver in such contexts. The second reason is because this climatico-conflict frontline is increasing and changing the nature of protection risks. Burkina Faso is a sad point in case. The view from the dust of Dori is clear. Conflict and climate change are uprooting people, removing food from the tables, increasing illness and incapacity to provide healthcare, leaving people with disability, elderly, and minorities behind. In places like Somalia, Afghanistan, Mozambique, Iraq, Yemen, I see many colleagues from these operations with us today. Droughts and floods have repeatedly forced people to move. Remote and impoverished communities are in further difficulties year after year. Water scarcity, which challenges health, food, and economic security, is hitting harder due to the weakness of institutions that have been hit initially by the conflict, by instability, by fragility. All these layers or issues are reducing the capacity of communities to deal with the shocks and it's actually forcing them to become victims and survivors of what we refer to as negative coping mechanisms or harmful practices. Youth and child recruitment, child labor, kids dropping out of school, trafficking in people, especially girls and women, sexual violence, all is on the rise in these operations. And that's because the risks are higher, the resilience is lower, and this is the environment where we're operating. All these layers or issues are risking to reverse serious attempts and successes in development and stabilization. Should this development and stabilization be in place and continue, an important layer of protective environment would have been in place. So what's happening is like a perfect storm. Third, we are having this discussion today because we are still, as a sector, unpredictable and inconsistent regarding our role in such situations, even though it's a norm. Let me be clear, a lot of good work is done, and we have several good examples of clusters and cluster members conducting risk and vulnerability analysis, communicating with communities and sharing information, using early warning systems, working with local government and local actors, engaging with the DRR community and authorities, implementing programs to increase resilience and reducing exposure and actual response. So a lot is happening, and it's good. Good work done? Yes. Is it consistent? Absolutely not. Is it predictable with established accountabilities? Not yet in practice. Are we learning and systematically sharing knowledge and lessons? Not enough. We will keep talking to make sure that we are also consistently walking the talk in all operations. But the aim must be beyond walking, it must be running, actually marathon running. Fourth, and finally, because we need to lead by example. We as a sector must make our operations more sustainable by limiting the damage we cause to the environment and making sure that our operations are resilient to extreme weather events, and our program design is adaptable to gradual climate change, especially in places where it's reaching tipping point. So for these 4 reasons, I'm looking forward to this discussion and hope it will take us a step further towards a predictable, consistent, clear contribution by the protection clusters in addressing the impact of climate change, not the least its protection impact. Thanks very much, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Over back to you, Michelle.
Thank you very much, William. Now I'm going to hand over to Paul White, who's going to help to set the scene now for our discussion. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks a lot, Michelle. If we could move on to the first slide. I've just got a couple of slides, and my task is really just to introduce some of the protection issues that we hope that our panelists will pick up on this morning. I want to touch on Afghanistan because it's one place, as William mentioned, one of the top 12 as far as both conflict and climate issues are concerned. And every year we have at least one climate event, whether it's flood or drought, earthquake, and it's in this complex environment. So it's one reason that there's no reason that we shouldn't be well prepared to deal with these things. I would recommend that you peruse this, the notes we made from last year's forum on preparedness and community-based protection in a session that GPC did with PHAP last year. It identifies many issues that are useful and valuable, and just gives us a good rounding. One of the key points in that session was that it's so important to link localization with our focus on building support and national and local capacities. So this is one thing that we're keen to hear about today, is how have we developed our agenda in relation to localization and supporting national capacity where possible. Other things that came out were the fundamental part played by contingency planning. I'm sure many of you are involved in this from the protection angle. And when we're doing contingency planning, we need to be doing our protection work in each of the clusters, not just for ourselves. Other issues that I think help us develop our protection analysis are things like the weather alerts. Some of this needs to be cross-border these days. So for example, the work FAO were doing in Somalia started in Ethiopia. And by tracing what's happening in Ethiopia, we can work out what weather event might occur in Somalia. So it's not something that clusters can do easily country by country, but we need to do it within some sort of regional framework. So it would be good to hear if there are developments on regional work as well. I noticed children and women were top of the list of the deceased in the last flood in Afghanistan. This is a pretty sorry story, I think. Also informal workers. So the poor, the most vulnerable, seem to be the most susceptible to climate incidents. And that is a wake-up call for protection people to get more focused on those vulnerable groups. But let me just try and raise on the next slide a few questions. I think it's our task really to try and get rid of these bottlenecks that we find while we're working in our clusters. And we need to turn those constraints into opportunities. One issue that strikes me a bit is whether, because we're so focused on displacement, whether it's displaced refugees or just IDPs, we sometimes don't bring immobile people into our analysis sufficiently. So I wonder, is this why we sometimes miss women and children? Because they're the most immobile in the community? Is it why we sometimes miss persons with disability? We need to focus, I think, and analyse around displacement, but also we need to look very carefully at those who are immobile. So OHCHR recently did an analytical study of the impact of climate change on the rights of persons with disability. And they did a section there on human mobility, but they pointed out that it's often the most marginalised who can't move. And I think we need to build on this as protection people in order to ensure that we protect the most vulnerable to climate events. Another issue that comes up time and time again for the clusters is how do we support government and national civil society? This is particularly in the Asian countries where I've worked a bit, this becomes a bigger and bigger issue. The legal frameworks are important. Some of the governments don't see that the clusters have anything to offer or don't have sufficient to offer to make it useful for them to engage their time. Sometimes we produce too many coordinators, and we've been criticised for this in parts of Asia. So we need to be careful that we have something to take to the table when we're talking with governments and working with governments. And our localisation agenda is one thing here. Again, I can emphasise that regional meetings and regional fora are the places where we can contribute, and we can talk to government officials and also national civil society. Just a couple of other points that I'll pick up on that come from the protection cluster in Afghanistan. One is it clear who's mapping the protection gaps in a good country analysis? It's sometimes a task that's covered in the HCT protection strategy, but perhaps it's not clear exactly who's doing it and how well it needs to be done, how thoroughly it needs to be done. Again, in our recent flooding in Afghanistan, the big flood wasn't far from Kabul, so we were able to move material goods there quite quickly. But things like psychosocial support were missing. We hadn't done our analysis sufficiently well to understand what was required there. So again, we can sometimes respond at some levels, but we need to do a little more. I think involving people in the preparedness and planning stage as part of our localisation agenda is very key, and also identifying how can the cluster be involved in slow onset events. So how do we work in that capacity when we're geared up to deal with emergencies? So Michelle, they're the points that I wanted to raise just to get us started and to give us a bit of focus, I hope. So thanks a lot. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Paul. Loads for us all to chew on there. Now I'm going to introduce Eliza Gallos and Emmanuel Noel, both coming to us from Burundi, where they're working for IOM. Eliza? Hello, Eliza, do you hear us?
Good morning, everyone. Can you please confirm you can hear us?
We hear you well, thank you. Please go ahead, Emmanuel.
Okay, it's a great pleasure for me and Eliza to be part of this very interesting roundtable to share with you our field experience from Burundi in terms of protection mainstreaming into the AoR and vice versa. So can you please move to the next slide? Okay, great. First of all, would like to share quickly with you a background context of Burundi in terms of disaster reality. Burundi is like one of the countries in the world most affected by natural disasters, such as floods, droughts, landslides, torrential, etc. Can you please move back to the previous slide? The previous one, perfect, thank you. So as I mentioned, like this country has been affected by hundreds of natural disasters and affecting dozens of people, according to the recent study published by IOM. And like more than 83% of displacement in the country are due to natural disasters, according to the last study published by the TM department in IOM. And as you can see on the bottom of the screen, we in the middle we've got a diagram that gives you an overview about the displacement occurred in the country from 2013 to 2020. And on the right side, we've got like the map. And Burundi has 18 provinces, as you can see on the map. Each of the provinces has been affected by natural disasters, and there are lots of displacement due to natural disasters. So based on this kind of situation, we'd like to share with you a couple of experiences that we had in field, including protections into the activities. Next slide, please.
Sorry, we're in the same location, so we just had to coordinate. Thank you very much. So more about the displacement context and disaster in Burundi. So recently there was massive displacements for the size of the country. A few thousand people have been affected. So up to 46,000 people have been affected by recent floods. And around 18,000 people have been displaced. As you can see in the map in the left side, there were 3 different displacement sites, and then in blue there are the different communities that have been affected. This experience of recent displacement and of the emergency response put a bit more emphasis due to the lack of resources, as well as certain gaps that were identified. Put a lot the spot on what can we do to better integrate protection into the disaster risk reduction. Next slide, please. Here you can see also some more key figures on related to the displacement. So the number of people affected, as well as the different households, the fact that there were almost equally men and women who were among the displaced. IOM has also conducted a survey related to the intentions of the IDPs in terms of return, and this seems to be a situation which starts to become cyclical. People have issues in accessing their places of origin before the displacement. They lack means to conduct socioeconomic activities, and generally one of the conclusions was that it's just very little resilience to these natural disasters, despite the fact that these disasters occur cyclically, and they happen every year, not always in the same location. There was also a very high number of protection cases that were referred to different actors in the sites, and once we have done a protection evaluation, about which I will talk in a bit, an evaluation of the protection response, we concluded that integrating protection into the disaster risk reduction strategy in the country, as well as working on disaster preparedness with the different actors, we could actually reduce some of the protection risks that we have noticed when we were working there, when we were doing the emergency response. Could we have the next slide, please? So what you can see here, there's the operational approach that our organization has. IOM in Burundi is in a quite unique position, I would say, because we have teams that deal with displacement before, that deal with the natural disasters before they occur. So that's the disaster risk reduction team that whose projects are managed by my colleague Emmanuel. Then you have the emergency response, where you have shelter, NFI, CCCM, health protection, psychosocial support, but as well there is a team that deals with transition and recovery. So within our organization, we thought, why don't we work more towards, when it comes to protection, from the beginning to the end, before displacement, during displacement, and after displacement, and engage those other actors that are involved, especially the protection sector, anything related to the DR in the country, the authorities, to see what can we do to reduce the protection risk before the displacement occurs. Sometimes it's inevitable. Colleagues who work on disaster risk reduction, they do some work which is meant to prevent any displacement. Sometimes it's inevitable. So what can we do before this occurs? So next slide, please. We have conducted recently a protection assessment of the recent response. It was in July, August 2020. We have used the methodology which varied. So we talked directly with the IDPs, we talked to the key informants, including the protection sector coordinator, local NGOs, international NGOs, local and central authorities. We looked at the data from the cases, that were assisted in this case by IOM, but there were many other actors, including partners of UNICEF, partners of UNFPA, who are on the ground assisting, providing special protection assistance. We looked at the different reports that were made in the coordination teams on sites, and as always, we've done the visual observation. The aim of this assessment was really to understand how we can improve for the next emergency responses, but obviously there's so much that we can derive from that in terms of how can we inform the disaster preparedness work. How can we ensure that the issues of safety, dignity, meaningful access, and accountability, how can we work with the different stakeholders and the communities to make sure that actually there's knowledge and there are processes and there are things in place to ensure these before displacement, before the disaster strikes. What can we do? Participation and empowerment was one of the things that, of the conclusions from the assessment, that one of the issues in the assessment that showed that actually there is a need for much more of that, and there's a need for much more engagement of the affected populations. How can we make sure, for example, and this is something that the IDPs themselves have said, it would have been good to know how we can be involved in before it would have been good to know before the floods came and before we moved, what we have to do in these type of situations in order to ensure that our voices are represented. This is something we got from women who told us that, from disabled people. So it's clear that there's a lot of work that can be done before. Obviously, the gaps in addressing specific needs and risks, that's also something that came through, as well as how can we inform the future responses. And there were many lessons to learn, to which I'm coming back after Emmanuel presents a bit what is being done on disaster risk reduction in Burundi, because in the end, the recommendations that we will present in a bit are really based on like what's already existing. We are, of course, we can create new things, but in order to actually integrate a protection lens into disaster risk reduction, we have to understand what work is being done on disaster risk reduction in the country. And actually the protection actors have very little knowledge of that. That's also one of the issues which we realized when we have asked the different anything from local NGOs to the international organizations and to the authorities, when we tried to look at what can we do to reduce the risk of separation of children, for example, what can we do to reduce the risk of gender-based violence, how can that be linked to any strategy for disaster risk reduction. Actually, there was very, very little knowledge about and thinking and about disaster risk reduction, about contingency planning for that, from the protection sector and the protection actor side. So Emmanuel will explain a bit like what is being done on disaster risk reduction in Burundi, and then how what recommendations we have to actually work as protection actors, to work with the disaster risk reduction actors as well.
Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Hello, I think you're on mute. Emmanuel?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear now. Thank you.
Perfect. So I said, as mentioned, Elisa, our strategy is to see from the field side how we can better ensuring the mainstreaming of protection into their activities and vice versa, as RM in Burundi is leading the disaster risk reduction sector. So our challenges are not only to ensure that protections is mainly in streams in the in our RM activities, but also through the coordination meetings that we manage will be our best to ensure all the partners or the actors to get protection involved in the activities. Now we're implementing a 3-year program, the AoR program in Burundi, with the objective to strengthen the resilience to natural disasters, to natural disaster risk in Burundi. So that will be a comprehensive, multi-sectoral and community-based approach to disaster risk reduction. And from this project, we had three main results expected. So first of all, we support the government of Burundi to develop a multi-hazard assessment and risk mapping that will cover the entire country. And the second objective, so we're planning to strengthen the institutional mechanism, coordination, and contingency planning. That will be one of the components that will be ensured to have like protection mainstreaming. And the third component that will be community-based interventions. So our strategy is not only to have protection mainstreamings at national level, at provincial level, but also at the community level. Next slide, please. So this is like the recommendations finding from the assessment conducted by by the protection team. So we do our best to ensure that all of the recommendations has been taken into consideration in our DRRX. So the first recommendations was to ensure the level the work done by existing coordination structures to integrate protection into disaster preparedness. As I mentioned previously, IOM is leading the DRR thematic in the country. We've got like a DRR working group. So through this DRR working group, we were able to map all the DRR actors working in Burundi. And as you can see on the map on the left of the screen, so this map shows a little bit all the DRR actors working in the country, and also in link with the disaster risk areas in the country. So the strategy is not only to map the DRR actors, but also to ensure a mapping superposition with the protection actors to ensure not only at national level, we've got this linkage between disaster and protection, but also even at the provincial level, we've got this kind of involvement to ensure all the partners, all the DRR partners working in this thematic have a strong linkage with protection actors.
To complement what Emmanuel was saying, so there are so many different coordination structures at the moment, and we just want to make sure that they speak to each other. You can hear me, yeah. They can just speak to each other. For example, we were thinking at national level, there is the protection sector. We could invite colleagues and partners who do disaster risk reduction to introduce the topic. For us, it was a surprise in a way to see that there was a lot of the protection sector needs discussion and actors when they do anything from referral pathways to doing protection analysis. They focus so much on the emergency response that there is very little focus on what we do in terms of disaster preparedness for different parts of the country. And as Emmanuel said, actually, like, it's not centrally. In Burundi, as probably in other countries, you have different coordination structures, both for disaster risk reduction as well as protection. So, for example, there are different provinces. That's the main administrative unit. In Burundi is the province. At province, there are coordination meetings focused on prevention response to gender-based violence, done in certain cases, in most cases actually by state structures. But in those type of coordination, there's very, very little discussed in terms of disaster preparedness. So we would like to make sure this is happening. And also vice versa, there are working group, again, multiple actors. Not all of them would be the same as what we would call the protection actors, so the actors who do protection work. So that's also a great opportunity to make sure that in terms of reference of the DRR working group, you have considerations related to protection, and that there are concrete agendas related to risk reduction, but also protection perspective. And that is being linked with risk reduction.
Guys, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Natural disasters and related to, for example, socioeconomic resilience.
Eliza, sorry to interrupt you. We're going to have to speed it up a little bit. I know that you've got some other great points to make. Maybe you could prioritize a few to wrap up your session.
Yeah, the second recommendation that we found from the protection assessment, that there's really an urgent need of capacity building of DRR actors on protection issues. So the approach is not only to train the DRR actors on protection issues, but also have like the DR mainstreaming into protection activities. So that's why in Burundi mission, we're trying to develop together some kind of capacity building document. Can you please move back to the previous slide? Perfect, thank you. So I like to ensure that all the actors are well informed about like the protection issues, and vice versa, and protection issues are aware of their activities, and not only at national level and at field level. And the third recommendation is about the necessity to have some kind of consistent data collection and consultation of disaster affected populations, because we saw at the field sometimes when the actors are to conduct some kind of activities at field level, they just plan the interventions without the involvement of the community members. That's why it was suggested to ensure, so during all the process, before the intervention, during the intervention, and just after the intervention, to have the feedback from the community. That's why through our DRR project, currently, we have a data collection activities that we ensure to have the feedback of the community to ensure the strategy for the implementation of our projects. And then as soon as we're done with the collection of the data, we need to have the feedback from protection version to ensure that we are on the same page in the way to address not only disaster issues at the field, but also protection issues at the field.
Okay, I'm going to give you another 30 seconds to wrap up, because I'm afraid you're running all over time.
Recommendations. So in terms of capacity building, we'll have to start actually from zero, and this is actually a recommendation as well by the authorities here. It would be just a general introduction on what protection is, as well as what is the case of GBV, for example, incidents which are being disclosed. So quite basic things. If we can do that before for any displacement, before of any disaster struck, then the different stakeholders, and here I'm talking about the authorities, they would have a better capacity to identify, prevent, and mitigate risk related to child protection, GBV, trafficking persons as well. The knowledge is very of these actors which are oriented towards response in terms of disasters, as well as prevention of disasters. If they would have a basis, they would be able to better integrate into their planning, as well as all the way to the emergency response.
Okay, thank you, Elisa. I'm really sorry to cut you off. Elisa?
The consultation of, it's not enough to have consultation of those who are displaced now, but those who are at risk of displacement.
Elisa, do you hear me?
That's crucial, and this has been done very little. And of course, it has to be representative. It has to be guided. Actually, these type of consultations have to be guided by protection principles. And although the focus would be on how to build the resilience, on how to what are the issues that the procedures that could be put in place in case of a disaster, and what's the best way to respond, it would have to be guided by the protection principles, which is not something that could be taken for granted. Certain groups that we have consulted said that they felt they were less included into any type of emergency response from in terms of the decision making. So this would have to make sure this is actually being done in the disaster risk preparedness work as well.
And other recommendations that it was highlighted during the protection assessment, the need to strengthen and develop different scenarios that implicate a wide variety of actors pre and post disaster. So that's why in our DR activities we will ensure to have some kind of compliance and accountability mechanisms. Even before the developing the strategy to implement the community-based mitigation activities that will be implemented under this project through Cash for It initiative, because the idea is not only to this activity will contribute not only to mitigate the disaster risk at community level, but also that will have like an impact in terms of the income for the community members. That's why we want to ensure that we got the involvement of all kind of vulnerable groups into the beneficiaries, so that even after the intervention, they could contribute in terms of share their feedbacks in terms of the effectiveness of the interventions. And then for the next recommendations, it was clearly mentioned the need to increase accountability to affected populations. As I mentioned previously, one of the key outputs of our project related to the multi-hazardous assessment is to produce like a risk atlas, but we need to collect and identify some kind of communication channels to ensure that the risk atlas that will be developed at the end of this project are related, or this risk atlas is related to the needs of communities and end users, and this will ensure effective accountability, ownership, and sustainability of the project. Because sometimes we just stay at national level and develop some kind of strategy without having the involvement of community members. That's why, based on these recommendations, we'll ensure to have their feedbacks from community level as end user, even before the development of the risk atlas. And the next recommendations found was related to the contingency plan for response to disasters. So in Burundi, we got like 18 provinces and 119 communes. Some of them are contingency plan, and some that don't have. So our strategy in updating contingency plan for where they are contingency plan is to ensure that all group of vulnerable peoples are involved in all the process, not just to come and bring a contingency plan to the office without the involvement of the actors from community level. That's why before
thank you, Emmanuel, very much. Really emphasizing the whole point about the participation of the local communities, the vulnerable persons, and but we're going to have to move now, I think, into some plenary. We're already starting to see some comments coming in. Thank you so much for a very rich discussion. I know that you have lots more even to say, so maybe some of the colleagues online, we have well over, I think, 130 people online right now, might have some further comments for you from your situation in Burundi, or also not to forget also some of Paul's points that he was speaking to us about, reminding us about some of the questions such as remembering people who are immobile, that maybe we're creating a protection gap there by forgetting people who are actually not on the move or unable to move. The importance of capacity support as well. I think there's some similarities there in your presentations. Good country analysis, thinking about isolated areas, thinking also about how we're providing information. I think some similarities in the example from Burundi with what Paul was saying. But also the role of the protection clusters also in slow-on situations. That was another question. So I think we've already got some questions coming in from the group. So Paul, maybe you could also turn your video back on. Are you still there, Paul?
I am indeed.
Great. Hello, welcome back, Paul. So Elisa, Emmanuel, and Paul are here online, ready to take your questions. And here I have a question about the DRR mapping. They'd like to know who actually took the lead and how did you create the interest to contribute, especially as people's capacities were already quite stretched, probably. Would you like to take that question about the mapping process? Emmanuel or Elisa?
Yes, I've run the question. So as I mentioned previously, RM is leading the DRR sector in Burundi, and we work closely with the national platform, which is in charge of DRR portfolio in the country. So through the DRR working group, we ensure to have all the DRR actors to be present at different meetings to explain all the strategy for the mapping activities. And let's see, talking mapping data in Burundi are a little bit sensitive. So that's why we need to have like the great involvement of the government authorities to ensure that we are on the same page with them, but to ensure to have like all the partners input. So through the DRR working group, as we've got like a monthly meeting, we share all the data collected, and all the partners again, and also the government share the feedbacks on the data, and all of them are involved in the process. Thanks.
Thanks, Emmanuel. I have another question here from Howard, and he's talking about the role of localization and national civil society, as has been referenced not actually only by the colleagues in Burundi, but also by Paul. So there's already considerable momentum on governments through disaster risk reduction and the climate agendas, but we observe a relative neglect and underfunding of national and local civil society. So here's the question: what, in your view, could be one very specific, practical priority action for how protection actors and/or climate actors could more effectively engage with and support national civil society on this agenda? Do you have one specific or practical priority any of you would recommend?
For me, Michelle, I think one thing we can do together is work on communication and messaging. It puts us in touch with a very wide variety of people, and it's something that in many ways can be non-threatening and incredibly valuable. So, of course, the key thing is to talk to civil society and see exactly what they want and what sort of support they want. But particularly when we have AAP resources available, then I think that can be a very important way of ensuring we're building awareness and working closely with civil society.
Mm-hmm. Is that something that rings a bell with you also, Elisa or Emmanuel, in your Burundian context?
I would have, I think, another suggestion as well. In addition to what Paul mentions, it's really involving those actors into different coordination structures. So for DR, for example, there are different ones. For protection, they should be quite inclusive. But a lot of these initiatives are too much, I think, focused on international organizations, international NGOs, as well as the authorities. So making sure coordination structures, events, workshops, trainings, they are open, they are truly open, truly accessible to the national actors. And I think that's key. And one of actually the key, it's important that they are consulted at all times. And even if not all coordination structures would automatically include national NGOs, local actors, national actors, which are not states, it's really important to make sure that at least then you consult and you create the events for that. And there's, in the case of Burundi, there was quite a bit of more funding available recently on disaster risk reduction. Therefore, we just have to make sure that those key actors are also involved, consulted, and trained.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about them being truly open to those national actors, what is it that makes things truly open? Elisa? Yes,
it's for me. Yes, so I think what's really important is to be transparent and to communicate what you're doing, what you intend to do, and where you need more feedback. And making sure that the invitations are being sent out and they are, as I said, meaningful access to those meetings, which means supporting whichever way it's possible. Again, I can talk from the context of Burundi, where there was significant funding coming from the EU, specifically on disaster risk reduction. But in that context, we just have to make sure that the organizations that do protection work, protection actors, which are not identified as disaster risk reduction, they are the ones who actually have access to that. And that's what we, with the leveraging of the existing coordination structure, that's what we have to do. I think it's a very, very important point and question: how can we involve more those actors which are not international organizations, international NGOs, and state structures?
Mm-hmm.
I hope I did answer.
That's great. Thank you so much. I have another question here from Lindsay, who's asking how you go about including refugees and asylum seekers in national programming on disaster risk reduction and climate change, as well as in the mainstreaming of protection in the national framework. So how are you going about ensuring that they're included, refugees and asylum seekers? This is a question to any three of you in different contexts.
Here in Burundi, we have more of an internal displacement context. So a bit less refugee and asylum seekers. But what I can imagine is the important thing is, as we said before, is that type of consultation, which has to be continuous, not just consultation, but as well data collection. So for sure, it's something that it should be included into contingency planning, into basically like these groups. And actually, Emmanuel somehow mentioned, he didn't specifically said refugees and IDPs, but participation of different groups in the disaster risk reduction work. At the moment, we are at the level, and here I can talk about Burundi, when not even the participation of all of the groups of concern are is not reflected. So enough in terms of disabilities, if the groups that they were mentioned, a bit less for this context, but maybe relevant for others, refugees, asylum seekers here, internally displaced, any other representation has to be considered. So it will be part of that strategy of representation, but at all levels, anything from referral pathways, consultations, contingency planning, coordination structures, everything. I know I'm a bit vague now, just because for the concept of Burundi, there are some refugees, but that's not. It's probably will be more relevant in other countries.
Yeah, I would like quickly to add a couple of additional information to these questions. So, as you know, as mentioned, Elisa, Burundi is a bit specific in terms of the context, very difficult areas. But as I mentioned in the presentations, I think through the development or updating of national contingency plan, that will be a best opportunity, a great opportunity to include like refugees and asylum seekers in the national programming on disaster risk reduction, and also even through the implementation of the community-based disaster risk activities in the provincial, where there are some kind of IDPs or this kind of people, we can ensure, and certainly with the support of the government authorities at provincial level, to ensure to get this kind of people involved in the implementation of the community-based activity. I think that's so.
Great, thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, Elisa. Okay, we have another follow-up question now to a suggestion that you made, Paul, about the resources on accountability to affected persons that could be mobilized to engage and fund national civil society. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that idea? So, for example, is there currently any kind of data available which can show to what extent those resources are channeled and used in this way? Or could documenting the extent to which this is currently done be a useful strategy for the GPC globally in its efforts on localization? Paul?
Sure. Well, I think it probably is something that needs to be
as
checked
we are
and
just at the
piloted.
beginning of our risk mapping.
Sorry,
that will
Emmanuel.
be very useful for the government. It will be for the
Emmanuel?
first time Burundi will
Paul,
have this kind of mapping that will cover the entire country to provide background info in terms of disaster risk areas and to inform the national strategy for disaster risk interventions. But as one of the outputs of the risk mapping activity for the upcoming rainy season, we are preparing a recommendation note for the government in terms of advices and recommendations how to manage the areas the most affected in the past with the disaster with the previous disasters. So we're trying to help the government through the technical note for the upcoming seasons, but at the end of the risk mapping, that will be useful to inform or to all this DR strategy in the country, not only for the government but also for the DR actors. But as I mentioned previously, we think that we're preparing a technical note to support the government in terms of recommendations for the upcoming rainy season.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Back over to you, Paul.
Okay, so I'm familiar with the fact that the Humanitarian Advisory Group has done some work on this issue of communication and linking it with protection in the context of climate change. So I would recommend some of their work for colleagues who want to have a look at what's been done. I'm not entirely sure that it's something that the GPC would want to take up or need to take up. It's definitely worth having a close look at in particular areas. But I think the key thing is to be sure that it's something that civil society are keen to do and to partner with us on. I suspect some of the regional meetings and some of the climate activists in the Asian region that I'm a little bit familiar with would be quite keen to work in this area. But I've not looked at it in a lot of depth, but I know some colleagues, particularly the Humanitarian Advisory Group, who I think already have some links with the GPC, have done some work on it already, and I'd recommend their website to have a look at what they've been doing in this area. Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks very much, Paul. Okay, watching the time, so we'll just take one more question, I think. This one again back to you, colleagues in Burundi, about what was actually done in the field prior to disasters in order to reduce protection risks. So if you could focus very specifically on the preparedness activities that you have actually invested in, please. Over.
There was quite a bit of service mapping and referral pathways being developed, although it was done by the protection sector, so not in conjunction with the other actors, which also play a role in disaster preparedness, and especially not, I think, not enough with the authorities, and I think that's needed. Other work that has been done, which I think is quite good. Again, it was not the land disaster preparedness, but that it actually helps with that. Was child protection work done in the country related to documentation, what happens, information of population related to what happens in terms of access to documentation as well as family reunification. But
so
it's
kind of mapping of what's available in terms of documentation.
Was incorporated to what it could be done, the predictability as well as the slow onset trends that we see in Burundi.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Elisa. All right. I think we're going to just take a couple of minutes break now, everyone. Thank you. We've already got plenty of ideas circulating in the air there. So you're going to see just a picture going onto your screens, and here's some music just for a couple of minutes, just to give us all a time to stretch, look away from your screen for a moment, and we'll be back with you in just 2 minutes. Thanks, everyone. everyone, welcome back. I hope you've all just give you a second to sit down and settle yourselves again. And we're going to continue with 2 more speakers, starting with Nelson Tivan, who's working for NRC in Mozambique. Over to you, Nelson.
Hi, good afternoon from Mozambique.
Good afternoon.
Can I be here loud and clear?
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. So are we going to share my presentation then? I said it's okay, thank you. So can you go back to the first slide, please? The first slide, please. Okay, thank you. I do understand that I have a long time short. My name is Nelson Tivan. I'm a consultant for NRC and I'm leading Water into Action project in Mozambique. Actually, Water into Action is a document which intends to provide practical guide to different governments on developing and including disaster displacement into their legal framework. So before I jump to the remarks that we are bringing as some insight to this forum, it's worth to mention that it's pretty our understanding that to integrate disaster displacement in national DRR laws and policies is about securing and strengthening protection for displaced people and people at risk of displacement. The second thing is that main of issues that we will be addressing here, it's part of what we have been discussing with the government in order to make sure that those issues are addressed within this disaster displacement guideline that we are developing. Second slide, please. So there were 3 questions which I was supposed to speak on. And the first one was actually to try to provide from our experience in Mozambique, what are the main protection issues and gaps in the context of disaster and climate change. From our experience, I do understand that there are a lot of protection issues on the ground, but it's also our perception that many of agencies operating in Mozambique are focusing, maybe due to the context, on what I can call that most visible protection issues, leaving aside or maybe not really putting much attention on what I do call invisible threats or invisible violence. We see that often people who we serve are subject to, I'm talking about women, child, and also men, when they are in a context of having access to humanitarian assistance, they do subject to multiple and in-deep type of exploitation. I will not go through those, but this is, I say this on the basis of the context that Mozambique has a kind of limitation in evidence on the prevalence and perpetration of this type of violence. And the specific violence is also complex in the context, and there is also a multiple interesting barrier to report this type of violence and assessing appropriate service to protection. So I do think it's understanding that this, actually we were discussing, I will be talking about this later, we were discussing about how to put together this type of violence and see how we can address within the work that we are putting together with the government. The second thing that we as a group came in a conclusion that might be a kind of gap on the women protection issues is the need to put into action the advocacy process on women's rights. You see, when it's the context, when we are in a context of a humanitarian assistance and response, mainly women are most vulnerable groups. So women in Mozambique, those living deeply in a rural area, they do rely on agriculture to make their livelihoods. And actually, there is a document in Mozambique called the drought, which gives women the right to have the land which they are working on. And this is the absence of these two called drought. It's the main, I would say, the main limitation avoiding women to be part of family general decisions on managing humanitarian crises. I will say that the second main issues and gap in the context of Mozambique is the need to move from talking about needed action. The last week we had a discussion where we were focused on greening the operation, but also I do understand that we do have a need to move from this idea of only speaking to ensure that agencies with protection mandate can take a leadership on legal protection issues related with disaster displacement. And this is one of the things that we also discusses within this project that we are implementing with the government on how we can make sure that these agents can make part of the group putting together this disaster displacement. Second slide, please. So the second question that there was a need to speak on is the good practice and anticipatory action on prepared measures. I do believe that I was also part of, I am part of the protection cluster in Mozambique. I do believe that as from the work being done, there is a lot of good data, assessment and evaluation on protection issues available about Mozambique protection issues. So what really come in has a remark, has a question. Actually, there is an internal debate about it. It's how does this available data, how does this assessment and evaluation do include community structures and disadvantaged groups in terms of representation? So the thing is that through our work with the government within this project, World Interaction Project in Mozambique, we are kind of discussing about how we can make sure that agencies with protection mandate can provide a consolidated and coordinated approach to facilitate and realize really disaster and displacement and climate change related protection issues during the response. So we have come across, actually we start to put together, to map different actors, where in a UNIT National High Commission for Refugees part, we met, we discussed, and then we are trying to bring them as part of the projects. And the idea is to see how we can together work and jump into actually the second thing that is needed. And together we can work on having a kind of systematic group of response, not only involving groups operating at national level, but also at provincial and district level. This leads us to what I call through my presentation as the good practice and the need of improving to involve different groups in different levels.
Nelson, we're running short of time. Could you move on to your final slide, please?
The last one. You can go to the last one.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap up quickly, please.
So, okay. On thinking about the future of protection cluster and AoR in preparedness and future of protection cluster in Mozambique, I think that there is no way for us to think on addressing protection without those groups of actors addressing different protection issues. This is fact, because although we do have a lot to improve, but the work is there and we are doing it in a very good way. Actually, the protection cluster is also doing it in a very good way. So I do think that has a recommendation, which is to see how we can put together tools and mechanisms in field that help us in understanding and improving experience of people who we serve and work with on assessing protection issues. This is put in two parts. Actually, is understanding the systematic protection issues and also see how we can fit and put and relate diversity and disadvantaged groups on it. The second and last recommendation that we brought I actually spoke about it, but it's the need to improve the link between national protection cluster and local actors. We see that many of agencies do operate in national level, but when protection issues happen in the field, we do have to rely on local actors to actually at least try to report to us in order for us to do a quick move, engage with different platforms, including different institutions, to see how quickly we can address those. So those are a kind of up, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Nelson. Okay, now we're going to move from Mozambique and the experience there to another region entirely, to the Pacific. And so I'd very warmly like to welcome Andrew McElroy, who's joining us from the office in Suva. Andrew?
Hello, good evening, Michelle. Good evening, colleagues, and greetings from Suva. Greetings
Welcome.
from Fiji. Thank you. So, Michelle, just wave a flag if I talk too much, but I'll try to keep to the 7 minutes. I have maybe 2 overall points I'd like to make, 3 specific comments related to the Pacific region, quite different perhaps to Burundi and Mozambique, which we've heard from previously, and then just 3 concluding remarks. So in terms of the 2 overall reflections, the first one to say is I think disaster and climate risk reduction and protection really are 2 sides of the same coin. Whichever terminology we want to use, I think the end goal is pretty much the same. So just I think it's important that we perhaps don't get too hung up on mainstreaming this and mainstreaming that. You know, good programming that really sort of has a good understanding of community capacity and vulnerabilities will really address both agendas, I would say.
Hi, Andrew. Sorry, we lost you there for a moment. Could you cycle back a couple of sentences, please?
Yes, sorry. This is the problem in the Pacific in the evening. We lose some bandwidth. No, but the point was just to say that really disaster and climate risk reduction and protection, I think are basically 2 sides of the same coin. And I think it comes down to an understanding of risk, capacity and vulnerability, and really addressing those, whichever terminology we wish to use. The second opening reflection I'd like to make is really referencing the Pacific, and I'm not sure how colleagues in the other countries would agree or not, but in the 3 years I've been working in the Pacific, more and more I'm seeing the evaporation of this often false separation between disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, the evaporation of a false dichotomy between humanitarian and development programming. And you know, more recently, in terms of the pandemic crisis we've faced, you know, it really sort of tells us that we need to approach risk management, you know, risk-proofing development in this era of climate change, really from a perspective of multi-hazards, whether they be a pandemic or a climate-induced flood. Now, in terms of the Pacific region, I think this ongoing climate emergency and this era of pandemic has brought to us what is essentially consecutive and compound disasters. And I think this is a harbinger of things to come, in that we will see increasingly countries, communities, in fact regions, really never quite recovering from one disaster before another, either connected one or separate one comes. And so I think that's really important in terms of protection, for the foresight that we need in terms of what is needed in terms of effective protection programming in the future is really important to reflect on, because in an era of escalating and now escalating climate and pandemic risks, as we're seeing, it really sort of it leads us to be much more agile and adaptive in terms of the approach that we take. We can't just rely on the past as a predictor of the future anymore. So in this region this year, we had what was called Tropical Cyclone Harold in April, which was a Category 5 storm in Vanuatu. And by the time it got to Fiji was a Category 4 storm. And what we saw in both Fiji and Vanuatu is those dilemmas that we are often seeing in humanitarian and/or development contexts is even accentuated even more. So for example, in terms of protection, how do we balance between the need to take people away from harm's way to an evacuation center during a pandemic when there's a need to preserve some kind of physical distancing? It's quite a difficult dilemma to juggle. Another issue that really came up here in the Pacific was during lockdown measures. You know, how do we reach out to particularly those girls and women who may be forced to stay with their abuser? Really how to sort of balance that awful dilemma. And then a third dilemma we saw, particularly in the case of Vanuatu, very strict border protections to keep COVID-19 out, which is still the case in Vanuatu today, but also the need to allow international assistance into very vulnerable and exposed populations. And the three sort of concluding thoughts that I would like to make, Michelle. Firstly, it's around data, and our colleagues in Burundi and Mozambique both referred to this. It's both a struggle and an opportunity. You know, the more we understand the risk of vulnerable communities which are not homogeneous, which are not static, then the better place we are to provide that effective support that is so needed. But it's a real struggle, at least in this region, to make progress around the disaggregated data that would allow us to have a more nuanced picture of vulnerability in the Pacific. The second concluding reflection I'd like to make is around governance. And next week, the 13th of October, is the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, and it will focus on governance. And the experience we had in the Pacific during this COVID-19 period was unusually the political will was largely there to prevent the crisis. But what we saw was that the governance mechanisms were not fit for purpose. So we have an opportunity here in the Pacific with a slew of reviews of legislative arrangements in many of the small island development states, where we can really sort of have a look and relook at the protection element of future legislative frameworks that will govern national responses to future disasters. And then the third and final point from my side has been touched upon by Paul and others, and that is the so-called localization agenda. And for me, a better term is that currency of trust. How to build and strengthen on that currency of trust at the local level in terms of the leadership and the networks that exist. And that really can be the compass for both national and international development partners to really be more effective in their support. And that more than ever is needed, as we've seen this year with the limitations of movement around this region and many parts of the world. So with those few words, Michelle, that's all from Fiji. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thanks also for making that link to the additional compounded complexity that many of us, many of the colleagues in the field are having to cope with just now in the midst of this pandemic. Okay, so now everybody online, this is your chance to ask your questions back to Nelson and to Andrew in particular. But if you have other questions also still from the previous speakers and you'd like to link some of those issues together, you are very welcome to do so. I see some issues coming up as sort of echoing through around understanding vulnerability and some of the challenges around that in terms of protection, what that means. As Nelson was putting it, this sort of systematic protection approach versus something which is about diversity and disaggregating data. I don't know if they're both different things or the same thing. Interesting point anyway that you're making there. This currency of trust, that's an interesting one. I like that language, Andrew, and linking to involving the communities themselves, the theme of consultation, of participation, and the whole different range of actors who need to be involved when we're talking about being better prepared. So, do we have some questions from the floor? So while we're waiting for some comments to come in, perhaps I'll just put a generic question to you, the most recent, to Nelson and Andrew, about how you think the global protection cluster, or the clusters in your region or in your country, and the areas of responsibility how can the clusters support, the field clusters, and the AoRs in their preparedness? How can the global protection cluster support the field and the national action by the AoRs? Any ideas there? Andrew, Nelson?
Hi.
Yeah, hi, Michelle. I can kick off if you like. I think, I mean, interestingly, here in the Pacific, we have a kind of a double challenge, in the sense that the absorption capacity in terms of local government, local national governments, is quite limited. So I think one of the things that, while it's not maybe a conventional context for many of our protection colleagues to be operating in, I think one thing that's really important is to have that ability to be adaptive in terms of how the system is supported and coordinated, particularly in contexts which have their own particular characteristics of fragility, particularly in terms of capacity to coordinate. So I think just one reflection from my side. Over.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Would anybody else like to comment? Nelson, how can the global protection cluster be better supporting?
I think, so just to top up on what Angelo was saying, I think that the work is already there. The national protection cluster in Mozambique is operating, although there is a lot of, there is a huge place to still go. And one of them is to create this link between local actors, the national cluster, and the global cluster. Because you see, in Mozambique, many of these protection issues do occur at rural level, in rural areas. So the main actors operating in rural areas are local non-government organizations, through which don't have much in terms of linking and linkage between them and the national protection cluster. But the agency is operating and responding to the diverse type of issues under climate change and disaster. They do have connection with those local non-government organizations. And the second thing is that I do understand that there is a need to finalize the conversation with the government regarding to protection issues. In Mozambique, I don't know if it's about the contest or not, but there is a thing where when you start a conversation, you have to finalize, mainly when you're working with public institutions, in order for them to take this matter in a serious level. When you start off and start in between, they also think that is not something that is concerning much people who we serve. So in order for us to improve at least the awareness and also the importance of addressing protection issues, there is a need for global protection cluster, national cluster, and different actors to push the conversation within the government. Thank you from my side.
A real strong, important advocacy role there, I think you're talking about. Thanks, Nelson. Andrew, back to you again. There's a question from one of our participants, whether you could please unpack a little bit more. You were talking to governance, and could you unpack that a little bit more, perhaps thinking specifically around preparedness and the role of the government vis-a-vis also other actors, including the UN, civil society, etc., in the region? Yes,
thank you, Michelle. It's certainly not the most exciting word in the world, but the more I gather experience around disaster risk reduction, whatever we want to call it, the more I see it's really important. So governance is not government. At least how I understand governance is it's how decisions are made, how resources are allocated. So in that sense, it's many different things, many wheels turning under the bonnet. So it could comprise, for example, policies, which are essentially statements of intent, vision, if you like, from a national or local government. It comprises legislative frameworks, which is the engine room, which kind of decides who has the power, what are the triggers in certain circumstances. And policies and legislation exists across government. And interestingly, one of my reflections here in the Pacific is it's a very vibrant space for disaster and climate risk governance, very vibrant. But this proliferation, if you like, really perhaps needs to move a little bit more in gelling together in terms of how things work together a little bit more. It's really art and not science, I must say. But I would just, drawing on the reflections of government colleagues this year during the COVID-19 pandemic, I take it as a really plus point that many governments, Fiji included, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, others included, are really reflecting that they need to revisit their governance arrangements to take account of what is a very dynamic and changing riskscape, not only here in the Pacific, but globally. And you know, climate, pandemic risk really sort of fueling traditional disaster risk as we would have understood it in the 90s, perhaps. And I really applaud government colleagues for that foresight to really try and revisit their risk governance mechanisms. Now, these are not easy processes. So, for example, here in Fiji, the review of the National Disaster Management Act, which dates back to 1998, it began in February 2008. And of course, a lot has happened in that time. And 2.5 years down the track, we still have some work to do. But it's really encouraging to see the government of Fiji, if you take this act to the village level, really hear from the people in terms of their experience and how this will action sort of decision making from the government level that will really have a positive impact at the local level. So, you know, governance in a couple of sentences, Michelle, is how it is the mechanism how we make decisions and allocate resources to manage the disaster and climate risks that we face. Over.
Thanks, Andrew. You know, in terms of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, the Pacific region is often held up as really forging the best practice, something that others can learn from. Would you agree with that? Or do you think that the context in the Pacific is so very specific that it doesn't really translate elsewhere?
I would agree with that. So Tonga in 2010, so 10 years ago, became the first country in this region and possibly the world to launch an integrated disaster risk and climate change adaptation national strategy. It was called the JNAP, the Joint National Action Plan on DRR and climate change adaptation. So that was 10 years ago, and that has prompted a similar approach in other countries, for example, in Kiribati. And interestingly enough, it is an example whereby national leadership has influenced regional policy making. So in 2016, 6 years after the first JNAP in Tonga, the leaders of the Pacific region, they agreed to what is called the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific, an integrated approach to disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. And I think the wisdom of this approach is maybe twofold. I mean, certainly it has vision, but it's also founded on common sense. And that is, there's a recognition, as I referred to earlier, that the capacity of institutions in the Pacific is quite limited. So to silo what are essentially, as I said earlier, often two sides of the same coin, to silo those into different policies and strategies doesn't altogether make sense. And similarly, you know, if you're at the village level or even at the town or city level here in Suva, where I am, you don't see people on the street dissecting the world in terms of the way often governments and development partners dissect the world. They look at their lives, their livelihoods in a holistic way. And I think it's up to us and the Pacific governments and regional, at the regional level too, have taken a cue from people to say, yeah, this is far better. It's far better to us look at this holistically, it's more effective and actually makes more sense. Over.
That's perfect, Andrew. In fact, one of the comments that's come in by one of our participants is speaking to this challenge around how populations who are affected by different types of disasters or different types of crises are sort of siloed into different groups. And so there's this dichotomy working. Perhaps Nelson, you could also, you might have any comments on that as well. It's like how can these separations, these artificial separations be overcome? Andrew's talking there about how this holistic approach taken to policy can really help in that regard. Would you have any other experience from Mozambique or reflections from your experience? Nelson?
Hi, Michelle, can you come again on the question, please?
Yes, we were just talking about how you get over the situation where sometimes different populations who are affected by a different disaster or perhaps by a different type of crisis, a conflict-related crisis within the same country, are separated, even if the same populations are being affected both by the impacts of natural hazards, for example, as well as by conflict. How do you overcome such situations? How can you make sure that the approach that's taken actually takes into account all the different types of risks, the multiple hazards, as Andrew put it, can be taken into account for the same populations?
Okay.
Or if you're getting stuck by my question, maybe any of the other speakers actually from their own context, from Burundi or Paul, Afghanistan, if you'd like to comment on that, how you overcome that separation, that artificial separation sometimes that occurs.
Well, hi.
Go ahead, Nelson.
Well, it's a kind of hard question in terms of Mozambique, because as you understand, the country is still working on different, actually many of different disasters are kind of new for Mozambique. You see, for instance, in the last 2 years, we have cyclones, we have droughts, we have the, now currently we do have COVID-19, which is something that the country itself is not prepared to deal with, but we have to cope with the situation. But as I can say from our experiences, the fact that we are trying to work on building local capacity. As for now, for instance, the government has advised us to work with in a local organization which is building local capacity. In this particular question, we are addressing the trust process, right? The government has advised us to work with an organization, local one, which is working on building capacity of what they are calling as a local agent of change. The local agent of change are people who the community themselves do trust them in order to unpack the process of different impacts that they have been suffering, but in particular on these protection issues. That's coming with the government on the base of they're trying to address protection issues into a preparedness phase. So this will help us in at some point understanding, for instance, in Sofala, a province which was affected by Idai, and now currently is also suffering a high number of people infected by COVID. So the idea is to try to have these people, these local agents of change, on engaging and building the trust with community in order to have them unpacking different impacts that they are suffering. But in a case of in a right and still existing mechanism that can help us to address those, I think that we don't have. But the main issues here is that the main and positive issues here is that the government is aware of the need to unpack these different impacts and is engaging currently with us, NFC, PDD, etc., within these projects in order for us to really include preparedness, protection issues in a very different phase. And we see how we can address these different impacts to different people or to the same group of people.
Those local change.
Thank you, over.
Those local change agents, Nelson, are they government officials or are they civil society?
These are from civil society. Actually, civil society is helping the government on building capacity to local agents of change who are coming from the community to work directly with civil society.
Fantastic.
This is the idea, because actually the perception is that people can trust more people from their set and group of culture than government and local organization has the context here in Mozambique. But it's working. We now have 18 people enlisted, through which we will have to talk with them in order to understand how we can bring this knowledge through our guideline, and see how we can also spread to different actors and call their attention. Look, this is an example that can work. This is an example that we can take in considering how to address protection issues in the preparedness phase.
Thank you so much, Nelson, for bringing us, for speaking as well on this in this very practical way on how you build this culture of trust, and echoing, I think, a very strong theme across all of our speakers today around the importance of participation, consultation with communities, but not just consultation, actually using the capacity of the communities as local change agents in this case to really work with the government to support preparedness, to support disaster risk reduction. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Nancy Polotan-Toyeres, our Senior Protection Officer, who will talk to you all about some of the next steps coming up. Nancy, over to you.
Thanks, Michelle. And I just wanted to thank again to all the other co-leads that we've been working with in the GBV AoR, UNHCR, IOM, and NRC. And just to say that for our next steps, as you've seen, we've set the stage with this event and highlighted some of the very interesting and good examples from Burundi, and Mozambique, and from the Pacific region. So for this is very key for what we aim for, is to look at how we as protection actors, especially the field protection clusters and AoRs, can be involved in this systematic inclusion in preparedness and anticipatory action. So, so this was our public event. It was one of our second public events since 2019. As Paul White mentioned, we had a GPC PHAP event back in November that looked at community-based protection and how we can work effectively in dealing with disasters and climate change. So we're hoping, and we're also planning in the next few weeks to work with our co-leads from NRC, GBV AoR, IOM, to organize smaller targeted consultations. We will reach out to our partners and our field protection clusters and AoRs in the field for regional consultations in the Asia region, in the Africa region, in the Americas region, and elsewhere in Africa region, to have more targeted discussions about how this work on preparedness and anticipatory action, how this can be incorporated in future guidance that will be useful for our field protection clusters and AoRs. And before I go over to our evaluation, I want to hand over to Natalie to speak a bit of the guidance that she's working on. Over to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Nancy. I just wanted to mention quickly that from UNHCR side, we have been developing draft operational guidance on IDP protection in the context of disasters and the adverse effects of climate change, focusing on key protection issues and priorities to be considered during both the preparedness but also the emergency response phase. So we're going to start the internal consultation with field colleagues anytime soon. And we are hoping to have it as basis also for discussion in these regional workshop or consultations that you just mentioned, Nancy, for the GPC specific guidance on preparedness. Over to you again, Nancy.
Thanks, Natalie. And so right now, I would like the participants online, you'll see in the chat box, we have an evaluation on a Kobo form. I don't know if, Pamela, can you put the link as well in the chat, please?
Yes, it's there, Nancy.
Okay, super, thank you. So we'll take maybe 2 or 3 minutes if you could fill out this form. This will be helpful for us to formulate our targeted sessions as well for the different regions that I mentioned. So I'll give you about 2 to 3 minutes and then I hand back. So after this, back to Michelle. Thank you. Michelle, I'd like to hand back over to you.
Hi, Nancy. Sorry, I was having a little trouble reconnecting for a sec. So everyone, you may be continuing to finish those evaluation forms perhaps just after the call, but I'd like to just introduce our final speaker now, Cecilia Rosselli, who's the Director of Norwegian Refugee Council in Geneva. Cecilia, inviting you to make your closing remarks. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you all for this very enriching discussion today. So thanks to all presenters, participants for their active engagement throughout, and also Michelle, thanks to you for your wonderful moderation of the event. Going back to the main reason highlighted by William at the beginning, why we are here today, I think that there is nobody questioning the why. The climate crisis is becoming one of the major humanitarian challenges, and it raises multiple protection concerns. We have heard today from several colleagues how climate change exacerbates pre-existing vulnerabilities and affects people already marginalized. The challenge and the most difficult part is to identify how we address this and who is best placed to do it. The discussion today provided, I think, a very good platform for sharing good practices and also to share experiences from several different contexts, and provided good suggestions for the protection clusters, for the AoR, and also for the global protection cluster on how to continue supporting communities and governments in their efforts to reduce protection risks. I would like to mention a few from the suggestions that were made by colleagues as very important. Several pointed to the need to better integrate protection in DRR and DRR into protection. Andrew actually mentioned these as two sides of the same coin, and I really agree that this is an important element we have to take home from today's discussion. Colleagues from Burundi insisted on the importance of leveraging the work done by existing coordination structures and work closely with other clusters in the sector as a whole, and also working at regional level. I think this is extremely important going forward. The fundamental role of communication and messaging was repeatedly mentioned as key, as well as the obvious link with the localization agenda. I particularly like the reference to the currency of trust as a way to refer to localization, because I think that's the way forward to make sure that we really involve local actors and first responders into coordination structures, being open, frank, and transparent in the way we consult and make sure that we are all coming together. The importance of the key role that could be played by national leadership was referred to by Andrew, and I think is an interesting example that we can see and look forward in future conversation. As well as taking an holistic approach to policy as a way to continue address the protection risks related to climate change. I would like to make reference to a couple of available tools that were somewhere already referenced during the conversation. The Words into Action guidelines that was brought up by several of you, including from our colleague in Mozambique. The eco guidance on disaster preparedness that is coming up with a clear focus on protection issues, and also the timely release from UNHCR of the legal consideration regarding claims for international protection made in context of climate change and disasters. These are tools that are already available to all of us, and I really think it's important that we make sure that we take advantage of what already exists. By closing, as a co-chair of the GPC SAG, I would like to echo William's call at the beginning of this event on the important role that field protection clusters, AoR, and the global protection cluster can play in preparedness for protection in the context of disaster and climate change. And I would like also to make a call to start acting on protection in climate change without waiting to know it all. This is just the beginning of a conversation that I hope we will continue, including through the consultations that were referred earlier by Nancy. So thanks again to all of you, and just to restate that NRC together with the GPC stands ready to support this continued dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. And I will just repeat your thanks also to all of our fantastic speakers today, to William for opening, to Paul, to Eliza and Emmanuel in Burundi, Nelson in Mozambique, Andrew in Suva, and finally Cecilia here in Geneva. Thank you all very much, and wishing you all a good day or rest of day wherever you're coming from. Thank you. Bye-bye.